distinguished participants and speakers, I would like to welcome you to the Peace Building and Human Rights Activism panel. Yes, peace building is a relatively new field in the political science and international relations disciplines that came into view in mid-1990s. The concept was first used by the UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali in an agenda for peace in 1992. We all know, the Secretary General, so probably his name is quite well known. So it was part of a United Nations strategy for the resolution of conflicts, since traditional peace building proved to be ineffective to cope with the security challenges in the post-Cold War era. As described in an agenda for peace, peace building requires strengthening the institutions to consolidate a sense of confidence and well-being between people. The concept improved in 1995, supplement to an agenda for peace, to include creation of the structures for the institutionalization of peace as an essential goal. Borrowing from Johan Galton's terminology, who is known as the father of peace studies, peace building is interpreted not only ending the warfare, described as negative peace, but also targeting the root causes of conflict, which is positive peace. So for Galton, different from various methods for the resolution of conflicts, peace building has a connective approach. Peace as abolition of structural violence in the form of suppression rather than the abolition of direct violence, which is the armed struggle. Therefore, advocates of peace building argue that the conditions which lead internal local conflicts and their consequences require a comprehensive approach to keep peace. This goes beyond military and security priorities to address the issues of governance, democratic legitimacy, human rights, and rule of law, and of course, a functioning civil society that might enable war-torn countries to increase their resistance to new rounds of violence. The main objective of peace building in post-conflict societies is generally to acquire multiple transitions: a security transition from war to peace, a political transition from authoritarianism to a more participatory political system with respect to human rights, and a social-economic transition. So among the instruments of peace building and post-conflict agenda, we see governance reform to build stronger state institutions, organizing post-conflict elections, undertaking military reforms and disarmament, guaranteeing human rights, return of refugees and displaced persons, and empowering civil society. So the human rights aspect of a peace-building operation is regarded crucial for successful peace building, which is actually all about our panel. So most peace-building missions have included a human rights component to monitor post-conflict human rights violations and the response of local authorities to those violations, with an aim to develop local capacity to address such violations through educational and institution building activities. In many internal conflicts, government officials themselves have contributed to severe human rights violations. Punishment of the war criminals and reforming the involved organizations has been regarded as one of the conditions for the new governments to establish their legitimacy or re-establish their legitimacy. And if human rights are not guaranteed and the violators are not addressed, reconciliation at community level can hardly take place, as it was actually mentioned in the previous panel. So within this context, various tools developed to address human rights violations. Among these are establishment of war crime tribunals inside or outside of the country, creation of reconciliation commissions. I think Mustafa will talk about in his speech on the case of Colombia. And human rights field operations, such as dispatch of human rights monitoring missions and training civilian police forces. I'm glad that the speakers in our panel will talk more about the link between peace building and human rights activism on the ground, I guess what Hubert and Andromache has been doing. So let me introduce you the speakers. Professor Hubert Fausman is a well-known academic and expert on British colonial Cyprus and post-independence Cypriot history and politics. His research focuses on also hydrocarbon politics in the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as the relationship between state and society, where he focuses on political culture, clientelism, and political patronage. He has published numerous books, book chapters, and peer-reviewed articles on those issues. Andromache Sofeklos is a political analyst and activist. She is one of the founders of Unite Cyprus Now movement, working for reconciliation and unification. She has been active in the Cypriot civil society for years. Her research includes, among many others, the rise of far-right, hate speech in Cypriot political system, natural gas developments in the region, and the local media setting in relation to the Cyprus problem. She is also co-producing Nicosia Uncut political broadcast at Island Talks, which is a trilingual podcast station in Cyprus. Assistant Professor Dr. Mustafa Erçakıca completed his doctorate in Galatasaray University's Social Sciences Institute, Public Law, and he specialized on post-conflict law. He's an academic in law faculty and teaches courses related to international law. And his articles also published in various peer-reviewed journals and books. So the floor is yours. We're starting with Professor Hubert Fausman.
Okay, I'll go over there.
Okay.
Now it works. Tunaiden. I just learned that during the break. I only knew Gunaiden and I realized that's not going to work. We are too late. So Tunaiden it is. Thank you. It's very easy. And thank you, Mustafa, for helping out. Or Kalimera. Hello, everybody. Or Guten Tag at the off chance that there's German speakers in the audience. What am I going to do today? Killing my PowerPoint, apparently. What did I do now? Can we bring that back on? Ah, yes. I pressed the wrong button. That was my mistake. Yeah. This is what I wanted. Yeah. Okay. I'm the director, and in that capacity I'm here. I'm not just an academic. I'm the director of the Office of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation here in Cyprus. And I want to talk a bit about the work in the context of peace building and human rights activism. A few words about the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, because some of you might not know it. It's an old one. It's a German foundation founded in 1925 and named after this guy on the right, Friedrich Ebert. He was the first president of the ill-fated Weimar Republic, the first German attempt at democracy that ended in 1933 with the takeover of the Nazis. When he died in 1925, he was a social democrat. He set up a foundation at his funeral. He asked for donations to allow working-class children to study at universities. And this is how it started. It was then proscribed by the Nazis, refounded in 1945, and then became something unique, I think, globally, of a system that Germany has, that it has foundations that are affiliated with political parties. In this case, it's the Social Democrats, funded by taxpayers' money to do good related to the values of the party. So the Ebert Foundation is close to the Social Democrats. That's the party of the ruling Chancellor Olaf Scholz at the moment, so we're in power, hooray. And we're dedicated to the values of social democracy, which are freedom, justice, solidarity. But of course, human rights, peace are all core areas on which the Ebert Foundation works. You see the figures here. We have an annual budget of 180 million. We do around 3,000 events, seminars, and conferences in 106 countries all around the world. And that arguably, this is the show-off slide, makes us one of the most influential think tanks there are internationally. There's a ranking, as you can see. It is probably the second best network globally that think tanks have. And some of our jobs, and including mine, is to provide policy advice on the countries we are in case German politicians in particular, but not exclusively from the Social Democratic Party, want to know what the hell is going on in Cyprus and can you tell us more. The work of the Ebert Foundation in Cyprus started in 2011, so we are here for more than 11 years, and we are probably one of the smallest offices there is. It used to be me doing it part-time and one part-time employee. We get an additional one in January, so we're tiny. But we're tiny and active, that's what I claim. So we did around 30 events, including publications, seminars, workshops related to Cyprus a year. We have a podcast that's a bit dormant, but we'll resume with lots of series. One very relevant is about asylum, migration. We have a 10-episode podcast series, and I see some foreign students here. There's one about the fate of foreign students in the north of Cyprus, so you might want to listen to that with partners on the ground. We have a monthly newsletter that talks about what's going on both sides of the divide. In English, it's for free. You can get it via email. Check out our website or let me know, and you can get it, and it's one of the few where you get actually a coherent narrative of what's going on in the north every month, written by Sertaç Sonan, a dear friend and very good Turkish Cypriot academic. Peace building and human rights are at the core what we've been doing. My own background is that of an expert on the Cyprus problem, and I was myself an activist in a civil society organization. So to care about this has been really at the core of what we've been doing. To give you a bit more before we go into content, how much money do we have? It used to be around 75,000 in an operative budget. You can do a lot and little with it, depending how expensive your event is. The sad fact is that the work that's focusing on Cyprus will decrease in the years to come. That has to do with the fact that in 2021, my office was merged with the Office of Athens. But more importantly, that 2/3 of my work as of January will be for the Regional Peace and Security Project in Beirut, which means that the work of my office has to become more regional, and the budget that I have for exclusive Cyprus events will drastically shrink, but the work will not stop. Yeah? Positively put, we work more on regional issues. That's just PR, so that's the podcast series Beyond the Divide. These are some, I skipped one, yeah? Okay, obviously I told you Cyprus problem and peace building, confidence building, human rights aspects of the Cyprus problem have been at the core of the work of the Ebert Foundation, where we usually find local partners, local NGOs. Our job is to strengthen civil society. Emine is a regular guest at events we do, and other Cypriots as well. So our job is to help Cypriots to improve the situation on the ground of both sides of the divide. So we have local work, that's Cyprus problem-centric, and regional work, of which the Cyprus problem is part. So we work a lot on the Greek-Turkish Cyprus triangle, but a big load of work together with PRIO, the Peace and Research Institute Oslo, a very important partner for us, has been on hydrocarbons and trying to make the hydrocarbons off the coast of Cyprus a source of cooperation rather than confrontation. Obviously, we've not been very successful. You see some of the partners we had. As I said, our main job is to strengthen civil society and help Cypriots doing what they want to do because we have funding, which makes us attractive for Cypriots. So this is how I see our role here. Next of developing our own projects, this is just a sample of our publications next to the previous slide. Some are in English, but some are also in Greek and Turkish. So we're trying to have an impact on both sides of the divide and make our publications understandable to the people we want to reach. Human rights is another important pillar within the context of the Cyprus problem, of course, but also outside. Sometimes we have one-off reports, meaning we spot something. In this case, it was the LGBTI movement, which I thought there was nothing about the situation on both sides of the divide. What's the situation? What are the problems? What could be policy recommendations to improve their situation? And then I found a team of experts and activists who wrote that report. And it's published in Greek and in Turkish, and it's one of the things I'm very proud of. We did another report on hate speech, COVID-19 and human rights. Then we have consistent lines of work where we year for year follow up. That's corruption. That's not relevant here. You might be aware of the corruption perception report that we launch every year. But asylum, migration, and human rights has become a big issue from two angles, both from an international issue and what are the problems of refugees, why are they coming, but also the situation of migrants in Cyprus and what goes wrong there. And we work with local partners, local NGOs, and organizations like Voice, who represent students who are part of that situation. Freedom of speech, important for us as well. We work a lot with journalists from Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus for many years, building trust between them, trying to make more accurate how they report about each other. Not nicer, but more accurate, and have reliable sources in the countries. Therefore, hopefully contributing to peace in the sense that at least the propaganda can be deconstructed by journalists who know better and have reliable sources. So again, this is in Greek and Turkish. 2 more slides. What's our impact? If it comes to peace and reconciliation, or maybe in general speaking, it's very hard if you work on track 2 diplomacy. We're not politicians. We help civil society to try to move things. So you do a seminar, conference, you have a publication. You don't know who sits in the audience and who does something with this publication. So it's impossible to measure. If you talk about direct impact on track 1, we probably don't have a very strong record. I'm aware that 1 or 2 confidence measures, proposals from our partners were adopted, and that's pretty much as good as it gets. Yeah? So that is not really a cause for massive celebration. Of course we contribute to public debates. We bring new ideas in. We bring people together, and I think that's the most important thing, to keep the momentum going, support those activists who actually fight for the reunification of the island. And of course, by providing English and other language or German language publications on what's going on in Cyprus, we're an important institution helping to disseminate information about a problem that's very little known in the rest of the world, at least in many cases. So what's the current situation? Obviously, I'm not going into politics, but there's a problem here because we're talking about a debt process and an island that's rapidly moving in the direction of permanent partition. And when you're an organization working on peace and reconciliation, a strategic and tactical but very cynic question you have to ask yourself is, to what extent do you invest in continued peace building, or you shift your work on areas where there's something going on and you can change something on the ground? We'll probably find a middle way. We will keep working on peace, but at the moment it's a completely dead process. So it makes more sense to focus more resources on human rights violations, or bad governance, or issues on the island where you can actually help, or focus on confidence building measures that can happen while there's no progress on track 1. So it's a tough choice. Energy cooperation instead of confrontation, that we also had very limited impact. We've been pushing for the Norwegian model to be adopted. The parliament did that. If they did that because of us, we do not know. I think what we were very good in is, in particular, there was a lot of nonsense about East Med pipeline and the Greek Cypriots will all go rich and all the rest of it. And we've been fighting that from the beginning, bringing international experts to Cyprus and, in a way, countering the official narrative that, in our view, were nonsense, trying to give the public alternative, reliable sources from experts within this problematic field. A big problem that peace activism has, and civil society, members of the civil society will be very aware, is the preaching to the converted problem. It's probably the same in this room, so I don't think there are too many people who are eager on human rights violations in terms of committing them. Yeah? This is an audience that is dedicated to the respect of human rights. So you're already the guys that are convinced of that human rights and respect for it is a good thing. And that's similar at many of the bicommunal events. You have in the group Greek and Turkish Cypriots who've spoken with each other, who are open-minded, who take each other on. So to get to the mass of the population is the big challenge. And we have only been, to a very limited degree, successful in doing this. One trick is to do other issues that are relevant to other people. Might be hydrocarbon, but it might be LGBTIQ rights, and then people come and say, hey, I come to your next seminar on the Cyprus problem because I like your work. But there's a lot that could be improved. Human rights, my last slide. It's easier here, obviously, because you're dealing directly with problems in the country they can deal with. In the Cyprus problem, you talk about high-level politics that need progress on intergovernmental level. Yeah? So you need the Greek, the Turkish governments, and the leaders of both communities to do something. It's very hard to get to those 4. It's easier if you talk about LGBTIQ rights, or if you talk about freedom of speech in Cyprus, to get to the authorities, to get politicians from both sides to your event that can actually decide something in parliament. So I would argue we are much more successful in having an impact and reaching decision makers when we deal with local human rights issues that are not directly related to the Cyprus problem. The property issue, which is a human rights issue within the Cyprus problem, is tough to change for an organization like us and the partners we work with. But to improve the situation of freedom of speech, to fight for freedom of journalists, to improve the situation of LGBTIQ activists, that's something we have much more impact in, and we get parliamentarians from both sides of the divide attending our events and then hopefully bringing the reports and the policy recommendations into the political realm. So we have impact on external actors there. You also have an advantage because you have LGBTIQ activists all around Europe, so they can relate, and you fit in the Cyprus piece of the puzzle into wider debates, and then it mirrors back. And therefore you can create international influence. And of course, if we're lucky, some of the experts we hired for our reports are then invited to international conferences and tell people in Germany, Britain, Brussels, or elsewhere how the situation in Cyprus is. That's how I end. I wanted to go out with a bang, but that's it, also for time reasons. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Hilbert. Okay, now we continue with Andromahi, and she's gonna speak you here.
Thank you very much. In fact, I'm very happy I listened to Hubert's and Dilek's presentation. I think my presentation will kind of tie in together. In the presentation, I will firstly try to give a context about peace-building work on the island. I will try and explain how lately the need to reinvent the term peace, came into question. Then I will try and present some limitations and challenges in the work of people in the peace-building sector of civil society, and maybe some thoughts about the future in the end. So just to give a bit of context, I am sure that the people who are here know that you cannot discuss anything in Cyprus without touching on the Cyprus problem, either in a direct or in an indirect way. So this is kind of a blessing and a curse at the same time. A blessing for us that we want to keep the Cyprus problem into relevance, but also a curse for us because what is dominant in the society, and I believe this is mostly true in the Greek Cypriot society, but we see it in the north as well lately, is this Cyprus problem fatigue. So people are sick and tired of listening about the Cyprus problem, and this means that they are also sick and tired of listening about all the repercussions of the problem that we often fail to see. So I think that here is where the concept of peace comes into place, in the sense that for many years, and as Dilek explained, the concept of peace building is a relatively new concept. So even in Cyprus, for many years, the focus has been on asking for a Cyprus problem solution, and that has been seen as a way to sort of put an end to the human rights violations that stem out of the problem in itself. In focusing a lot on this pushing for a solution, this has sort of put the focus of even civil society actors on the island. Their focus has remained on the leaders. So it has remained on a tier 1 level, pushing for a solution. And this is where the need to reinvent the concept of peace comes. This is where we need to understand that peace is not simply, a political solution that will be given by people at the top and somehow it's going to reach to people. You need work. You need to work on empathy. You need to work on directly on our traumas. We need to work on our fears. We need to work on our demons. We need to work on our crimes. We need to work on our mistakes of the past. We need to work on empathy, on understanding. All of these have somehow been kept at the sidelines of the Cyprus problem for many years. And the focus has only been on a political level, pushing the leaders, and the focus from the people was not there. So in this setting, we need to also understand that we are faced with a so-called frozen conflict or a so-called status quo, and I, in fact, believe that these terms are kind of the most dangerous terms when it comes to the Cyprus problem, because there is no such thing as a frozen conflict, and there is no such thing as a status quo. So we are faced in a situation in which, whilst the Cyprus problem solution is pending, and the Cyprus problem solution that has to do with everything that is directly related to the problem, but at the same time, because of this protracted conflict, we are also called to face all the repercussions of this unsolved problem. And these repercussions have given birth to other issues, to human rights issues. An example, I mean, there is this black hole, let's say, in the north when it comes to some issues that relate to international law, and we see how the treatment of women, of foreign workers, of students, of LGBTQI community, how this is impacted in the north because of this black hole when it comes to international law. At the same time, in the south, we had cases in which police officers failed to perform their duties when it comes to investigating the disappearance of migrant domestic workers because they used the Cyprus problem as an excuse for them not to proceed to investigating, and they were saying, oh, they went to the north, or oh, they went to the occupied areas, and we are talking about women who were discovered eventually to be the victims of a serial killer in the Greek Cypriot community. So we see how the Cyprus problem brings with it consequences that are directly linked with the problem, but also consequences that are directly linked with the absence of a solution on the ground. So in this changing context, people working for peace or even advocating for peace on the island have had to change their methodology. And Unite Cyprus Now, an organization in which I am part, is one of the examples of an organization or of a movement that started with the intention of pushing the leaders towards a solution, but then in the failure of leaders, it kind of embraced its responsibility in civil society in terms of connecting Cypriots, of bringing people together, of creating empathy, and of working on crucial peace and true peace-building work on the island. So I'm just going to give some examples of how our tactics have changed. I mean, in the past, all you had was, these big rallies, PR statements just calling for a Cyprus problem solution in general. But when it comes to Unite Cyprus Now, and not only, there are many youth groups especially that are working a lot on peace building on the island at the time. But from my experience in Unite Cyprus Now, basically, we kind of decided to use social media a lot in terms of bringing people, bringing our message closer to people, always having in mind the issue of clicktivism, of course, which means that people might be willing to embrace your cause online, but this does not mean that they consciously ascribe to it or that they are going to fight for it in every realm of their lives. So in tackling that, we came to understand that there was a need for a clearer vision of peace to be created on the island. A vision that would not only be calling for a Cyprus problem solution, but most importantly, a vision that would give a meaning to peace on the island, because peace is not an abstract term, and we have been using it as an abstract term for many years, and we decided that we needed to make our demand for peace on the island linked to the demand for human rights respect on the island, linked with the demand for the European Union values, and we needed to give substance to what we mean that we want peace on the island. So peace is not simply an end to conflict, which in the case of Cyprus we do not have, I mean, in terms of military conflict, but peace is also cultivating those values that promote coexistence, that promote respect to one's values, respect to one's rights. And here, I just want to mention a few of the limitations when it comes to working for peace and trying to link human rights to it. We need to understand that in a country that has not worked on its wounds, we have people that are traumatized. Traumatized people cannot empathize with others. Traumatized people cannot hear about human rights violations of others and feel that they can do anything to help. In fact, I want to give one example, especially from the Greek Cypriot community, as to how the trauma of 1974, instead of acting in a way of creating Greek Cypriots that will be more empathetic to the traumas and difficulties of others, it has created this mentality of a Greek Cypriot exception in which we view all others' trauma in apathy because we always put our trauma, our past, forward. So I'm going to give the example of refugee and migrant inflows. There is there is an increase in migrant inflows in the Republic of Cyprus. Most of them come from the north or from the sea. And you see how the media in Cyprus are labeling these inflows as invasion, as a third Attila. So what are they doing? They are using the traumas of the past in order to excuse the lack of action on a direct violation of human rights on the ground today. So these are the sort of indirect impacts of the absence of true peace on our island, an impact that we often do not see, an impact that we often do not, we fail to put the finger on it. So you have a society that is traumatized, that is fearful, that is mistrustful. You have an educational system that perpetuates this trauma, and I'm talking about an educational system in both the north and in the south, an educational system that promotes xenophobic, prejudiced, nationalist values. These people, the propagation of such mentalities cannot lead to the creation of people who will be in any way capable of supporting or standing up for the rights of others or for the human rights violations of others. So we need to understand that the lack of a solution to our problem is creating a spiraling of consequences on the ground that we often fail to recognize. So just to sort of put an end to this, what I want to say is that in Unite Cyprus Now, what we have decided is that we cannot refer to peace in a vacuum or in an abstract way. No, peace is related to a sustainable environment. Peace is related to LGBTQI rights. Peace is related to the support and protection of human rights. And we cannot be calling for peace in abstract as if the United Cyprus will be living in a sort of international vacuum, or as if the citizens of Cyprus who have been born and raised basically hating each other will wake up one day and say, oh, peace has finally arrived. So just to put an end here, what my message is that for many years we have been thinking that the Cyprus problem solution will bring peace on the island. But we need to reimagine what we understand as peace and understand that only through peace will a true solution come on the island. And this is what we are trying to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Andromahi, for such a powerful talk. Our last speaker is Assistant Professor Mustafa Erçakıca. I think he will take us out of the Cyprus problem, so we'll see that the problems we face are not actually unique. Yes, Mustafa.
Thank you, Hocam. Hello, everyone. I am really glad to be here with you today, and I would like to thank the Human Rights Platform family members that gave us the chance to be all together today. Now we will visit a very far away location in the world, Colombia, that is much closer to positive peace compared to Cyprus and sadly Cypriot. So my aim is to approach Colombian post-conflict period and transitional justice period from a legal perspective. I will have two main points. Firstly, I will quickly mention to the historical background of the Colombian very long conflict period. And secondly, I will have a quick look to the achievements that they concluded the 50 years conflict period, and they created a transitional justice system which seems like it is working good today. So my first point, the historical background of Colombia and Colombian conflict. So firstly, Colombia was Gran Colombia after it gained its independence from Spanish Empire, and then Gran Colombia lost some territories, and we had today's Republic of Colombia with today's territory. Either you look to the Gran Colombia history or Republic of Colombia history, sadly you see some social polarization actually. There were at least two polarized groups in Colombia, but sometimes more. So if we start to evaluate the Colombian history from 1910s or 20s, we see that there were three main polarized groups. Firstly, we had liberals, as they were using red color to identify their group identity. Then we see the conservatives, that they were using the group members were using the blue color in order to identify their political identity. So as we can see, even the colors that they were using were different from each other. And also towards the end of 1920s, we had a new polarized group, working class. So since 1920s, the social polarization and violence had been continued actually until the peace agreement. In Colombian history, the period from 1948 to 1958 covers importance. It is an important 10 years period. This period is called as La Violencia, as the level of the atrocities in Colombia was really, really high. During those years, about 300,000 people died and 2 million people experienced enforced disappearance. So after 1958 to 1964, there is a slight decrease regarding the level of the atrocities, war atrocities in Colombia. But from 1964 until 2016, the conflict continued. Actually, there's a little slight there's a slight decrease in 1990s, but I will come to that later on. And because of this political economic instability in Colombia, there are some organized armed groups that were fighting against the Colombian official forces. These groups, mainly three main organized armed groups, they adopted leftist political view actually, and the ordinary people were naming them as guerrillas, but from a legal perspective, we should accept that they were organized armed groups. The first and the most famous one is FARC-EP, in English, the Revolutionary Armed Forces People's Army in Colombia. This group was the strongest one, the most perfectly organized one, and it was supported by the people in Colombia that were living in the rural areas of Colombia. One of the main claims of this organized armed group was that Colombia needs a new agricultural land reform in order to support and help the people living in the rural area to gain some economic stability and strength. Actually, FARC-EP was fighting with the Colombian official forces, and they committed to some illegal drug dealing activities in order to gain some economic strength, but the people living in the rural areas were supporting FARC-EP because they couldn't reach to the public services via the government. So they decided to support this organized armed group, and this group, as it had economic strength due to the drug dealing, helped the rural area community. Second group, ELN, in English, National Liberation Army. This group was supported by university students, basically, and again, it was a leftish group. And we had the last organized armed group, M19, in other words, 19th of April movement. Actually, this was an important group as well, and supported by the university students and mainly working class, but Colombia achieved to dissolve M19 firstly. Then the conflict continued between Colombian government on the one hand and FARC-EP and ELN on the other hand. So actually these organized armed groups and Colombian government were not the only actors that were effective regarding the Colombian conflict. We have some paramilitary forces as well. The most famous one is United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. These paramilitary forces, especially the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, were established by the Colombian government. Actually, it's a claim, but the archives shows us that today, as they have the post-conflict period in Colombia, they can talk about this more freely. So they say government forces wanted to commit some crimes under Colombian criminal law, but government didn't want to commit to those crimes directly by itself, so they created these paramilitary forces, and by using these forces, they committed to some crimes. Basically, they committed to some international humanitarian law violations, sadly. Today, there's critics against the Colombian post-conflict period. None of the politicians was judged because of this link between the Colombian government and the paramilitary forces, but Colombian government admitted that the paramilitary groups, while they were active, they killed more civilians compared to the guerrillas or organized armed groups from a more legal perspective. 10 years before the final peace agreement in 2006, the most important paramilitary group was dissoluted, and members applied for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program. So the conflict continued between the government forces and FARC-EP and ELN. So why Colombia had such a long conflict period? I can summarize the reasons under 5 points. First one, the leftish armed groups called as guerrillas, and they were adopted Marxist-Leninist view. This is the existence of leftish armed groups is the first reason of this long Colombian conflict period. Second one, economic problems and drug dealing in Colombia. Third one, the support from the farmers and people living in rural areas to the leftish organized armed groups. So they got this rural area community support and achieved to continue to fight. And fourth one, existence of paramilitary groups. And last one, the Colombian official forces and their lack of authority in the rural areas, because Colombia didn't have a strong centralized administrative structure, so it couldn't exercise effective authority over the Colombian territory, especially in the rural areas. In 1990, they adopted a new constitution, and this helped the Colombian government to decrease the level of the war atrocities in Colombia, but somehow it couldn't continue for a very long period. In 1994, again, the high-level war atrocities gained, they continued in a high level. So, but after this, towards the beginnings of the 2010, there was a new motivation in order to reach peace in Colombian territory. So this is my second point, how the Colombian conflict is ended and how the structure of transitional justice system is shaped. In 2010, the former president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, made a very important declaration and said that what they are experiencing in Colombia is an internal armed conflict. So once you define an enemy, it is easier to fight against this enemy. So they made the legal definition, and then it became possible to have the legal floor to fight against this. After this admission of the Juan Manuel Santos, they made some reforms, and the centralized units of Colombian forces gained strength. it became easier for them to struggle, to fight against the organized armed groups. They made some regulations regarding the illegal drug dealing activities. So FARC-EP, which was the strongest organized armed group, lost strength, and it became possible for the government forces to have a negotiation floor with FARC-EP. So negotiations started, but of course, before this, I need to say that in the Colombian long, about 50 years conflict period, many international humanitarian law violations were committed, such as civilian killings, attacks to some hospitals, education centers, and also many young people who were under 18 used as soldiers, which is the main principle regarding the international humanitarian law. And also, when you experience a 50 years of, let's say, public violence, using violence became something usual, something ordinary, and we see that in Colombian history, domestic violence is something very, very ordinary, because you implement in your own special area what you see in your ordinary day life. So in 2010, the negotiations started. Colombian Parliament approved a new legal code, which was called as Victims Code, and under this victim code, whoever suffered from the war atrocities had the opportunity to apply for a proper remedy. The Colombian peace negotiations were started in Cuba. Then for a while, negotiations continued in Norway. Then they turned back to Cuba. They preferred to do this in another country to prevent manipulations, because it was something common for Colombian negotiation history to see these manipulations. And the negotiations for the first year kept as secret, but as they achieved to reach some mutual principles with FARC members, they started to make it public. Negotiations became open for everyone. So each party's Colombian forces and FARC represented by 10 representatives and 20 assistants during the negotiations, but they invited some ordinary people, some different social group members, such as women, LGBTIQ plus people. United Nations decided on some special victim groups and invited them to Cuba to take place in the negotiations. The negotiations continued under 5 separate forums, such as rural issues, political participation, drugs, victims, and implementation of the future peace agreement. Then in 2016, final agreement to end the armed conflict and build a stable and lasting peace was written and signed by the parties. It is one of the longest peace agreements in the world. It has 6 chapters and 25 annexes. It is really a huge, long text. Under this peace agreement, they created a system to implement the agreement. I will sum up. The integrated system of truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition. It has 3 subunits. They are still active today. The Commission for the Clarification of Truth, Coexistence, and Non-Repetition. The second subunit, the Unit for the Search of Missing People due to and in the context of armed conflict. And the most important one, because I am a lawyer, the Judiciary Mechanism Unit, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which made some judgments over the war atrocities. It is estimated that more than 50,000 former fighters in Colombia demilitarized, and they reintegrated to ordinary community life today. After Juan Manuel Santos, we have Iván Duque as the president of Colombia. He criticized a lot because they say that he didn't pay attention to the post-conflict social reconstruction activities, but also his period of presidency overlapped with the COVID-19, so maybe it's a reason that social reconciliation and Colombia rebuilding activities couldn't continue very well. But in 2022, we have a new president in Colombia, Gustavo Petro. He was a former ex-combatant, but he was elected as a president. And as far as I can see, they turned back to this peace or social reconciliation atmosphere again, but still there are negotiations between the Colombian official authorities and ELN members, so maybe we couldn't say everything is 100% perfect in Colombia, but as a Cypriot, I need to say that they are much closer to the positive peace, sadly, compared to us. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, all the speakers, once again for the insightful talks. And now we can have your questions, comments, or contributions. Could you please shortly introduce yourself and mention to whom you are asking your question? No? Okay.
I was listening to Mustafa Bey about Colombia, and we're talking today in the context of civil society activity. What was your observation about if or any or how much contribution there has been in Colombia to the whole process to reach where it is today, which you say is better than where we are today, by civil society in Colombia supporting peace or a peace process? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. As far as I could observe, because main sources regarding Colombia are in Spanish, and I know English, not Spanish, but as far as I could see, while they were having peace negotiations in Cuba and Norway, the civil society had some important forums, activities to reconcile the Colombian rural area with the people who are living in bigger cities or different social groups in Colombia. But officially, many of the civil societies were invited to Cuba, Norway, in order to take place in the peace negotiations. As far as I can see, in Cyprus, maybe there are some bicommunal activities, civil society activities. Maybe if one day we have leaders that really wants to reach to positive peace, maybe the civil society should be accepted to the official negotiations as well. Thank you.
Can I comment a bit here? Just on Cyprus. The only point I wanted to make here is that you need institutional and political will for true peace building. And sometimes we laugh amongst us with everything we do. We are like, it's like we are trying to be the monster. Like you have a monster against you that is somehow supported by every mainstream pillar of our societies. And you're trying, bit by bit to sort of weaken its foundations. But we need to be clear that we need political will and we need institutional support when it comes to true peace building on the island. And this is something that, with the exception, of course, of a number of Turkish Cypriot leaders, because I think the Turkish Cypriot community and political leadership before is much more forward than the Greek Cypriot one, but we need to see profound. And in fact, just take a minute and think of the 2016 good sort of atmosphere that was created by Mr. Akinci and Mr. Anastasiadis that infiltrated in the public. If that atmosphere had been taken up and concrete peace-building actions or goals were being put, that would have had a difference in our society. So away from leader-led focus, of course, but at the same time, we need to be clear that we need to be pushing for institutional and political support on this.
Let me just add something what you probably do not know. What worked really well in Colombia was that they brought different stakeholders, politicians, but also civil society activists from both sides from the different conflicting parties together, and forced them to develop what's called scenarios. So they were asked to think about the possible futures and then in detail draw a picture of what this will look like and what the consequences of the different scenarios, continued conflict, peace, are. I'm not at liberty to tell you much more, but I do know that this is applied to Cyprus at the moment, and soon this will become part of the public realm. So there's an attempt made to mirror the Colombian process or the contribution there in Cyprus. So study the Colombian process. It might have a lot to offer for this island.
By the way, I have a book on Colombia, so advertisement minutes, but it is in Turkish, so maybe those who are interested in Colombian case, you can benefit from my book. But also I have an article in English regarding the Colombian case. So please, if you are interested in, email me. I will try to send you either the book or the article.
Any more questions?
Merhabalar, ben Demos'tan Dilan. Aslında bir soru değil ama bir katkı yapacağım ben de yine Kolombiya üzerinden. Çünkü Kolombiya'nın barış müzakeresi süreci Demos'un doğrudan çalışma alanlarından biri olmuştu. Demos buna dair bir rapor çıkarmıştı. Burada sivil toplumun rolüne ilişkin bir katkı yapmak istiyorum. Çünkü özellikle kadın örgütleri ve LGBT artı örgütlerinin bu süreçte etkin rol oynadığına dair bir verimiz var hali hazırda. Ve hatta işte bir toplumsal cinsiyet alt komisyonunun kurulması ve bu süreçte kadınların ve LGBT artıların aktif rol oynaması Kolombiya'daki barış sürecinin inşası için önemli parametrelerden biri oldu. Ya buranın sivil toplum ayağı için hali hazırda yapılmış çalışmaların toplumsal cinsiyetle birleştiği yer oldukça önemli bence. Ben bunu eklemek istedim. Burada da kadın örgütlerinin ve LGBT artı örgütlerinin öz dirençlerinin oldukça önemli bir parametre olduğunu düşünüyorum. Yani onların bastırması sayesinde, onların bu sürece dahil olmakta ısrarcı olması sayesinde aslında bu süreç bu şekilde ilerledi. Ve diğer tüm barış inşası geçiş dönemi süreçlerini yaşayacak ülkeler için de bunun önemli bir case olarak ele alınması gerektiğini düşünüyorum. Teşekkürler.
Any other questions or comments? So it looks like we are ready for the lunch break. Thank you very much first to the speakers for really eye-opening talks and the questions and contributions. So we have the break now.